In this video, we're going to spell out James's argument for his conclusion that for some people in the genuine option to believe or not believe in God, it's appropriate for them to go beyond their evidence and believe in God. And in doing so, we'll see why he gives the article his title, "The Will to Believe," why we can think of what they're doing as willing to believe. So let's just quickly review. There's this skeptical principle, which we find among other people in Clifford, which says it is wrong always, everywhere, and for anyone to believe anything upon insufficient evidence. And why is that? Well, because believing falsely is very bad and should be avoided. And this principle can be used to argue that agnosticism is required, because in this situation, clearly, you take yourself, if you're in it, to not have sufficient evidence one way or the other, and therefore you shouldn't believe one way or the other. That's what the principle tells you. And James says, well, I don't agree with the principle. I think in some cases it's okay and appropriate to go beyond your evidence. And so for some of these people in this situation, it's appropriate for them to believe given the lack of sufficient evidence. So he starts, how is he going to get to this point? Well, the first observation he makes is that human beliefs have what he calls a passional nature. And I talked about this a little bit at the end of the previous video, but just to make sure we know what that means. We have emotions and feelings. These have been in the past called passions. And so when James says we have a passional nature, he means we have a nature that involves having passions, which means involve having emotions and feelings. And emotions and feelings can be understood as responses to values or perceived values. So when we love something, we think it's good. When we hate something, we think it's bad. When we're angry about something, we have a view that some injustice or that something wrong has happened, right? Value something bad has happened. When we're sad, that's a different way of thinking that something bad has happened. So as we talked about previously, pain serves as a signal for damage, that something is wrong and needs to be attended to. So all of these emotions and feelings we have, and that's what's involved in having a passional nature. But then part of having emotions and feelings are sort of responses to value. They're saying these things are valuable or not, are good or bad. And what's perhaps surprising is that James thinks that human beliefs are part of our passional nature. Why is that? Well, so you think, well, look, beliefs, what's the point of it? It's just the belief is to tell us how the world is, to accurately represent the world, to say things are this way, things aren't that way. And what does that have to do with our passions? Well, they connect us with the world by when they succeed, and that you might think is inherently valuable. One of the really amazing, neat things about humans is that we actually can have this really rich understanding of the world around us, much richer and deeper than other animals, for example, and that's just a good thing, a valuable thing, that our beliefs can be a goal of our passions. Also, our beliefs guide us in our pursuit of our other values, right? We try to act in ways that, if our beliefs were true, we say, well, suppose the world is like this, then, what are the effects of my actions going to be? So I'm trying to act in ways that would be effective given that my beliefs are true. So we rely on our beliefs in action. So our beliefs are caught up with our passional nature, both because on the one hand, there's something that we value, having true beliefs, and on the other hand, our true beliefs help us to act out our passions and to go after, to pursue our values. And James thinks that the skeptic, while is not sort of always upfront about this fact, does acknowledge it. Because how does the skeptic defend Clifford's principle? Well, they rely on value claims. They say that error is bad, and it's really good to avoid error. That it would be a huge mistake to have a false belief. So when James writes about this in the text, he says things like, you, on the other hand, may think that the risk of being in error is a very small... So Clifford says, believe nothing, he says. Keep your mind in suspense forever, rather than by closing it on insufficient evidence, and thereby incur the awful risk of believing lies. So people who go with Clifford, he thinks, and who say better go without belief than believe a lie. What are they doing? They're manifesting their own private horror of becoming a dupe, someone who's been taken advantage of. This person, like Clifford, may be critical of many of their desires and fears, but they slavishly obey the fear of having a false belief. That's on page 253 on the left column if you want to see that in the text. So James thinks that when the skeptic defends their principle of don't go beyond your evidence, they are making a value judgment. They're saying error is bad, avoiding error is good, and that their passional nature, their fears are they're expressing their fear of error. But not only does the skeptic make a value judgment, then the skeptic makes a very strong value judgment, says James. How? Well, what the skeptic says is everyone, everywhere, always should withhold belief given insufficient evidence. So that's like super general. But then, how are they going to argue for? That's what the Clifford thing says. How do you argue for that? What are your premises? Well, one of the premises is everyone, everywhere, always should do what? Should prioritize avoiding error, right? So, what should your priority be in any situation? Avoid error. That's not obvious. It's not obvious that avoiding error is the most important thing to do. Certainly, James does not think that it's the most obviously a correct view. And why not? Well, because there are other values besides avoiding error. What might those other values be? Well, one is attaining truth. And attaining truth and avoiding error, those are different things. Sometimes they're complementary. Sometimes getting one helps getting the other. But sometimes they're competitive. So let's just have a simple example of analogy or other example of competitive and complementary values, which are career and family. So career and family can complement each other. Having a happy career can help you support your family, and having a happy family can help you support your career. But of course, they can also compete. Sometimes you have to choose one or the other. So sometimes they're complementary, but sometimes you have to choose one over the other. You just can't do both. So truth and error can sometimes complement each other, or getting truth and avoiding error. So sometimes believing truths will help you avoid error. The more you know about Rex, the likelier you are to avoid false conclusions about Rex. The more you know about earthquakes and the weather and the sun, the less likely you are to attribute them to deities like Zeus and make mistakes about them. On the other hand, avoiding errors can help you believe truths. If you had lots of false beliefs about Rex, you'd probably end up, you wouldn't get they're truths you wouldn't get. So avoiding those errors, you don't make those mistakes, and you instead are more likely to believe true things. But on the other hand, the more you believe, if I just have lots of beliefs, that means I'm more likely to believe truly, and I'm also more likely to believe falsely, right? If I have more and more and more and more beliefs, then a bunch of them are probably going to be true, and a bunch of them are probably going to be false. Just the more beliefs I have, I increase the chances of having both true beliefs and false beliefs. And the less I believe is the opposite. The less I believe, well, that means probably going to have fewer true beliefs, and I'm also going to have fewer false beliefs. So either way, if I increase my stock of beliefs, then I'm doing more likely to do well on the getting truth and do worse on the avoiding error. If I have fewer beliefs, I'm more likely to do well on the avoiding error and less on the getting truth. So it'd be nice to find ways of believing that will maximize truth and minimize error, so that we increase our beliefs in ways that are likely to add true beliefs and decrease our beliefs in ways that are going to get rid of false beliefs. But we can't always sort of have a perfect method, just like we can't always have a perfect method for balancing career and family. We can't always have a perfect method for balancing getting truth and avoiding error. So sometimes we have to choose which value to prioritize. Am I going to prioritize getting career or family? Am I going to prioritize attaining truth or avoiding error? So what James points out then is, look, the skeptic always prioritizes avoiding error over getting truth. So the religious person gambles and takes on the risk of having the false belief that God exists. But the agnostic person also gambles. They risk lacking a really important true belief. So in both ways, you're both taking risks. One risk is, I'm going to make a mistake by having an extra false belief. Another mistake is, I'm going to make a mistake by missing out on a belief. So and the skeptic then says, okay, well, here's why we should agree with me. Here's why we should always be agnostic. It's always better to lack true belief than to have excess false belief. The skeptic thinks that it's having false beliefs is always worse than missing true beliefs. So we should always err on the side of lacking the true beliefs instead of having false beliefs. So in James's view, this overvalues error avoidance, right? The skeptic says, in all cases, for all people, it's correct to absolutely prioritize avoiding error. And James thinks this is a mistake in value judgment. So going back to that same paragraph that's on 252 that goes from the left column to the right column of the text, he says, for my own part, I also have a horror of being duped, of being taken advantage of and lied to. But I can believe that worse things than being duped may happen to a man in this world. So Clifford's exhortation, Clifford's principle, has to my ears a thoroughly fantastic sound. It is like a general informing his soldiers that it is better to keep out of battle forever than to risk a single wound. Victories, either over enemies or nature, are not gained in this way, and our errors are surely not so awfully solemn. In a world where we are certain to incur them in spite of all our caution, a certain lightness of heart seems healthier than this excessive nervousness on their behalf. So the skeptic in general, in James's view, is too scared about their prioritizing error avoidance is a way of being too scared about making errors. And instead, right, just as if you want to go out and accomplish things, you take the risk of failure. So with belief, you similarly are going to take the risk of having false beliefs in order to have some good true beliefs. And he thinks this is especially so in the case of religion, because the gains of true belief might be so great in the case of religion. And so later on, this is on page 256 on the right-hand column, he says, to preach skepticism as a duty until, quote, sufficient evidence for religion is found is tantamount, is just as much as telling us when, in the presence of the hypothesis, it's wiser and better to yield to our fear of being in error than it is to yield to our hope that the religious hypothesis might be true. So we have the religious hypothesis, we hope that it's true, we fear that it's not, and the skeptic says it's always better to give in to the fear than it is to give in to the hope. And James says, well, why is the fear so supremely wise? Why is it better to make a mistake through fear than it is through hope, right? The skeptic might be making a mistake through fear. They might be missing out on an important belief. And instead of there's the mistake through hope, believing when it's false. There's the mistake through fear, not believing when it's true. And the skeptic says, oh, it's always better to make the fear mistake. And James says, why? Why is that so? So, as we pointed out, right, gaining religious truth, if that was something you could do, would be valuable. Believing in God can change your life. It can have a big impact on it. And if the belief is true, that's a good change. If the belief is not true, maybe it's not a good change. But if the belief is true, it's a good change. And so that means that for at least some people, the possible benefit of believing truly in God is much more significant than the possible cost of believing falsely. We don't have the evidence to fully decide, or at least these people don't, which way to go. So they have to weigh the possible cost or the possible benefit of believing truly and the possible cost of believing falsely. And for some people, given that, if the belief turned out to be true, then they would be making this really big, good change. And that cost seems like that could be that benefit, could be really valuable, and it could be a lot better than the possible cost they would incur if it turned out that their belief was false. So the way James put this again is he says, if religion be true and the evidence for it still be insufficient, I do not wish, by putting your extinguisher upon my nature, to forfeit my sole chance in life of getting upon the winning side. That chance depending, of course, on my willingness to run the risk of acting, as if my passional need of taking the world religiously might be prophetic and right. That is, so I have this hope, this passional need to see the world in these religious terms, and if indeed that need is really answered, that the religious view really is correct, then it would be a great benefit. And so why should I that's a great benefit. And so you skeptic need to say why the cost of avoiding error is, or why the cost of error is so great that I should always prioritize avoiding error when I'm potentially, if I follow your principle, going to miss out on all these really good truths. Not necessarily going to miss out on all these really good truths, but I might be. So why is why is the cost of error so great that I shouldn't run the risk, that I can't run the risk of making that error? So James says a rule of thinking which would absolutely prevent me from acknowledging certain kinds of truths if these kinds of truths were really there, and that's what the skeptical rule would be, right? The skeptical rule says you don't have the evidence for belief in God, you can't do it. And James says, look, you're preventing me, this rule is always going to stop someone from believing in God. That's not a good rule. And so James thinks that the benefits of the potential benefits of gaining a religious truth need to be weighed against the potential costs of a false religious belief. And so he puts his argument. We can put his argument like this. So the first premise is, you should believe in accordance with the evidence and reasons, unless the evidence and reasons leave the issue open. And in that case, when the issue is open and undecided by the evidence, if the option is genuine, it's live and forced and momentous, then you should believe in accordance with your values. James thinks that the skeptic actually believes this, and what the skeptic has been doing is saying the value you should have is avoiding error over others. So the skeptic agrees with this premise. James points out for some, belief in God or agnosticism is a genuine option, and the skeptic agrees with that premise as well. But then James says for some of those people for whom belief in God or agnosticism is a genuine option, the benefit of true belief in God is greater than the cost of false belief in God. It wouldn't be terrible if I falsely believed in God, but it would be great if I truly believed in God. And James thinks that this is what the skeptic gets wrong. They mistakenly think that for everyone, the cost of false belief is greater than the benefit of true belief. And so we have the conclusion from these three premises: these people for whom the potential benefit is greater than the potential cost, they should believe in God. And this is why we have the title, The Will to Believe. It turns out that conscious belief is always partly a choice based on your values, and that makes it an exercise of your will. And so when you're confronted with this question of do I believe or do I not believe, if you're in this live, forced, momentous situation, you're going to be acting out of your will and out of your passion, and not just out of the evidence and of your sort of a very sort of reasoning and narrowly construed as the ability to evaluate evidence. And that's why he calls his paper The Will to Believe. So this can seem kind of persuasive, right? Like, oh, yeah, being a skeptic, there's sort of true, there's too much weight on avoidance of error. And once we recognize that we should be taking into account these values when we're thinking about how to believe, why shouldn't we take into account the possible benefits? And if we do take into account the possible benefits, then we can go beyond our evidence in at least some situations. It's a surprising claim, I think. It's an interesting and provocative one. In the last video, I'm going to offer a couple sort of possible questions about that claim.